There's a researcher named Charles Spielberger who spent 40 years studying anger, not violence, not aggression in the criminal sense. Ordinary anger, the kind every human being experiences, the frustration that builds in traffic, the flare of rage when someone says the wrong thing, the slow burn of feeling disrespected or dismissed. What he found was that anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions in human psychology. The popular model that anger is a pressure that builds up and needs to be released, that expressing it is healthy, that holding it in is what causes damage, turns out to be largely wrong. The catharsis theory of anger, the idea that venting reduces it, has been tested repeatedly and failed repeatedly. When people express anger, they don't feel less angry, they feel more angry. The expression of anger rehearses and amplifies it. The venting feeds the fire rather than extinguishing it. What actually reduces anger is the opposite of what most people think. The neuroscience of anger starts in the amygdala, the same threat detection center involved in fear. Anger and fear are sibling in the threat response system. Fear says something dangerous is out there. Anger says something dangerous is in my way and I can fight it. The amygdala fires. Stress hormones flood the system. Heart rate elevates, blood pressure rises, blood redirects to the large muscles. The body prepares for confrontation the same way it prepares for flight. The same basic physiological cascade, slightly different emphasis. The prefrontal cortex is supposed to modulate this, to evaluate the threat, to assess proportionality, to regulate the response. The problem is that the amygdala fires faster than the prefrontal cortex can respond. You're already angry before the rational part of your brain has fully assessed the situation. This is why the advice to count to 10 before responding to anger actually has neurological validity. Not because counting is special, because the 10 seconds allows the prefrontal cortex to catch up with the amygdala and potentially override the initial response before it becomes behavior. Chronic anger, the state of being frequently or persistently angry, is physiologically destructive in ways that parallel chronic fear. The cardiovascular effects are among the most well-documented. People who score high on measures of trait anger, not anger in the moment, but anger as a characteristic way of being, show significantly elevated risk of heart disease. The mechanisms are multiple. Chronic activation of the stress response damages blood vessel walls over time. Elevated blood pressure strains the heart. The inflammatory markers associated with anger chronically elevated contribute to atherosclerosis. Redford Williams at Duke University has spent decades documenting what he calls the hostility syndrome, the cluster of cynicism, anger, and aggression that predicts cardiovascular disease more reliably than cholesterol levels or blood pressure in isolation. A scenario, he argues, that the way you habitually think about other people, whether you generally assume hostile intent, whether you feel contempt frequently, whether you carry chronic grievance, is a more important predictor of your cardiovascular health than most of what medicine focuses on. The heart pays for what the mind rehearses. The rumination problem is what makes anger particularly sticky. When you're angry about something and you replay the situation, rerun the conversation, imagine what you should have said. Think about how wrong the other person was. You're not processing the anger, you're re-experiencing it. Each replay activates the physiological anger response almost as strongly as the original event. The brain doesn't sharply distinguish between remembered and current threat. The memory of an infuriating interaction produces cortisol and elevated heart rate almost as effectively as the interaction itself, which means that spending 20 minutes replaying an argument from earlier in the day is 20 minutes of physiological stress on top of the original stress. Rumination is the mechanism by which a momentary frustration becomes chronic anger, the event ends, the replaying continues, the body keeps paying. The things that actually work to reduce anger are consistently counterintuitive. A cognitive reappraisal, deliberately reframing the situation, looking for alternative explanations for the other person's behavior, considering their perspective, reduces anger more effectively than expression. Not because it's emotionally suppressive, but because it changes what the situation means, which changes the emotional response. Distraction works not as a permanent solution, but as an interruption of the rumination cycle. Engaging with something absorbing enough to pull attention away from the anger-inducing content allows the physiological activation to dissipate. Physical activity works, not as catharsis in the punching a pillow sense, but because aerobic exercise metabolizes the stress hormones that anger produces and returns the body to baseline faster. Scenario, time works. The physiological anger response has a natural arc. If you don't feed it with rumination, it subsides. The problem is that most people's default response to anger is exactly the rumination that prevents it from subsiding. There's a concept in Buddhism called the second arrow. The first arrow is the painful event, the thing that happened, the person who wronged you, the situation that went wrong. That arrow lands whether you want it to or not. The second arrow is what you do with it afterward, the replaying, the catastrophizing, the nursing of grievance, the stories you build around the injury. The first arrow is often unavoidable. The second arrow is always a choice. Most of the suffering that anger produces is second arrow suffering. The event was real. The ongoing damage is self-inflicted through the choice to keep returning to it. That's not a reason to feel bad about being angry. It's a description of a mechanism that, once seen clearly, offers a choice that wasn't visible before. Right now, whatever made you angry today is behind you. The event is over. The first arrow has landed. Whether the second arrow lands tonight is still in play. You can put it down, not because the anger was wrong, not because what happened didn't matter, but just because the body has been carrying it long enough. The physiological response wants to complete its arc. Let it, the breath slowing, the heart rate dropping, the muscles releasing what they've been holding, the anger dissolving, not because it was resolved, but because the body is done with it for tonight. Rest now. There is a lake in Cameroon called Lake Nyos that killed 1,700 people in a single night without any warning. No earthquake, no flood, no storm. The people in the villages around the lake went to sleep, and most of them didn't wake up. What happened was a limnic eruption. Carbon dioxide had been accumulating at the bottom of the lake for decades, dissolved under pressure in the deep water on the night of August 21st, 1986 something. Possibly a small landslide or a minor seismic event disturbed the water enough to trigger a turnover. The deep water rose, the pressure dropped. The dissolved CO2 came out of solution the way carbonation comes out of a shaken bottle. A cloud of carbon dioxide, estimated at 1.6 cubic kilometers, erupted from the lake's surface and rolled down the surrounding valleys at around 50 kilometers an hour. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It displaced the oxygen in the valleys below. People and animals in the path of the cloud asphyxiated in their sleep. Scenario cattle were found dead miles away. One man survived because his house was on slightly elevated ground. The lake is still there. It is still saturated with CO2. There are two similar lakes nearby, Lake Monon and Lake Kivu, with the same accumulation risk. Lake Kivu sits on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo and has a population of 2 million people living on its shores. Degassing pipes have been installed in Lake Nyos to slowly release the CO2. The risk has been reduced. It has not been eliminated. The Danakil Depression in Ethiopia is one of the most hostile environments on the surface of the Earth. It sits around 120 meters below sea level, one of the lowest points on the continent. Average daytime temperatures exceed 45 degrees Celsius year-round. It receives almost no rainfall. The landscape is a surreal combination of volcanic activity, hydrothermal fields, salt flats, and acid pools. The acid pools at Dalal, a hydrothermal field within the depression, have pH readings approaching 0, not slightly acidic, essentially pure sulfuric acid sitting in pools on the surface. The colors are extraordinary: yellows, greens, oranges from the mineral deposits, like something from another planet. And yet people live there. The Afar people have inhabited the Danakil for thousands of years, mining salt from the ancient lake beds and trading it across East Africa. They know the landscape in ways that make survival possible. Outsiders without local knowledge die. The Mariana Trench is dangerous in a way that's different from the other entries on this list. It won't kill you with heat or gas or acid. It will kill you with pressure. 11 kilometers depth, the pressure is over 1,000 times atmospheric pressure at sea level, the human body at that depth. Without a pressure vessel would be crushed almost instantaneously. Not slowly, the pressure differential would be so extreme and so sudden that the physics wouldn't permit a slow process. What makes the Mariana Trench interesting as a dangerous place is how little we know about it. The deepest point has been visited by humans only a handful of times. The most recent significant visit was James Cameron's solo dive in 2012. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than of the ocean floor at that depth. The danger of the trench isn't what we know is down there, it's what we don't. The zone of death is a legal anomaly in Yellowstone National Park. A quirk of constitutional law and the way the park crosses state borders creates a 50 square mile area within the park where it may be legally impossible to prosecute certain crimes. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a trial by a jury drawn from the district where the crime occurred and the state where the crime was committed. The zone of death is within the federal district of Wyoming, but the state of Idaho. No one lives there. A jury of the district and state cannot be assembled. No crime has been committed there to test the loophole. It remains theoretical. But legal scholars have noted that in principle, a person who committed a crime in the zone of death could potentially walk free on constitutional grounds. Brian Kalt at Michigan State Law School identified and published the loophole, hoping Congress would close it. Congress has not closed it. The zone of death remains. A North Sentinel Island in the Bay of Bengal is dangerous for a reason completely unlike anywhere else on this list. It is inhabited by the Sentinelese, a people who have chosen complete isolation from the outside world and who respond to contact attempts with hostility. They have done so consistently for as long as recorded contact attempts have been made, which goes back to the colonial period. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow illegally traveled to the island attempting to convert the Sentinelese to Christianity. He was killed. His body was not recovered. The Indian government, which has jurisdiction over the island, declined to pursue the case. The island is protected by law. Contact attempts are illegal. The Sentinelese have made their position unambiguous across centuries of contact attempts. What makes it dangerous isn't hostility exactly, it's the clarity of the communication. They have said no in every way available to them for as long as anyone has been listening. The danger exists entirely on the side of people who didn't listen. The world contains places that will kill you in ways your body has no response to. Invisible gas clouds, acid pools, crushing pressure, legal vacuums, human beings who want to be left alone. Most of them are far from where you are right now. You're in one of the safest places you can be, horizontal, warm, behind walls. The dangerous world is out there doing what it does. You don't have to be in it tonight. Rest now. The moon is leaving us. Not quickly, not in any way you'll notice in a lifetime or 1,000 lifetimes, but measurably, verifiably at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year, the moon is drifting away from Earth. We know this because NASA placed retroreflectors on the lunar surface during the Apollo missions, small arrays of mirrors that reflect laser beams fired from Earth back to their source with extraordinary precision. By measuring the time it takes the laser to return, scientists can calculate the distance to the moon to within millimeters. 3.8 centimeters per year, the moon is receding, and because the moon's gravity is what drives the tides, and the tidal friction is what slows Earth's rotation, and Earth's rotation is what determines the length of a day, the moon leaving means our days are getting longer, not perceptibly about 2 milliseconds per century. But the physics is real. 4 billion years ago, when the moon was much closer, the day on Earth was about 6 hours long. The tides were hundreds of meters high. The world looked nothing like it does now. And the moon made it what it is. The tidal effect is the obvious one. The moon's gravity pulls the oceans toward it, creating a bulge of water on the side of Earth facing the moon, and through inertial effects, a corresponding bulge on the opposite side. As the Earth rotates under these bulges, you get 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day in most locations. What's less obvious is how fundamental tidal cycling has been to the development of life. The intertidal zone, the region of coastline alternately submerged and exposed by tides, is one of the most biologically productive environments on Earth. Organisms there evolved to handle both aquatic and aerial conditions. The cycling stress of the tidal environment is thought by some researchers to have been a driver of the evolutionary pressure that eventually produced land-dwelling life. The first organisms to move from sea to land likely did so through the intertidal zone. Organisms already adapted to periodic exposure to air, already capable of functioning in both environments. The moon's tidal forcing may have been essential to creating the conditions that drove that transition. Without the moon, there might be no land animals, including us. The moon stabilizes Earth's axial tilt. The Earth rotates at a tilt of about 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane. This tilt is what creates the seasons. It's also what prevents the climate from being catastrophically uniform. The differential heating of the planet by the tilted axis drives atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns that distribute heat around the globe. Without the moon's gravitational stabilizing influence, the axial tilt would vary chaotically, potentially swinging between nearly 0 and over 80 degrees over millions of years. A near zero tilt would mean almost no seasons, tropical regions permanently hot, polar regions permanently cold. Scenario, a high tilt would mean extreme seasonal variation, parts of the planet in permanent darkness for months at a time. Scenario, Mars, which has no large moon, has an axial tilt that varies chaotically over millions of years. The history of Martian climate shows the effects, dramatic swings that would make complex life difficult to sustain. Earth's relatively stable axial tilt, maintained by the moon, has contributed to the climate stability over geological time that complex life requires. The moon's effect on biological rhythms extends beyond the obvious. Coral spawning is coordinated with lunar cycles. Coral reefs around the world release their eggs and sperm in mass synchronized spawning events triggered by specific moon phases, typically the full moon in late spring or summer. The synchronization is so precise that it happens within the same night across hundreds of kilometers of reef. The mechanism involves light sensitivity. The specific light spectrum and intensity of the full moon triggers hormonal cascades in the coral. But the precision of the synchronization across such vast distances suggests the moon is doing something as a coordinating signal that no other environmental cue could replicate at that scale. Fiddler crabs time their feeding and mating activities to tidal cycles with such precision that the behavior persists in laboratory conditions with no tidal cues. The internal clock runs on lunar time independently of external input. The human menstrual cycle, averaging around 29.5 days, has been noted as close to the lunar month of 29.5 days for centuries. The association has been culturally significant across almost every human civilization. The science on whether there's a genuine biological connection is complicated. Studies have found correlations between menstrual cycle phase and lunar phase in some populations and not others. A large 2021 study found that cycle synchronization with the moon was more common in people who spent more time outdoors and less time exposed to artificial light, suggesting that light pollution may have disrupted a connection that existed in pre-industrial populations. Whether the connection is real, vestigial, or coincidental is not settled. The question is taken more seriously now than it was 20 years ago. The moon has no atmosphere, no weather, no erosion beyond the slow rain of micrometeorites. The footprints left by the Apollo astronauts are still there, will be there for millions of years. The most permanent record of human existence currently in existence is 12 sets of footprints in lunar dust. On a dead world, perfectly preserved for longer than the human species will probably exist. Scenario, look up on a clear night and the moon is just there. The same object that has been there for 4 billion years, that stabilized the climate, that allowed complex life, that drove the tides, that may have pushed life onto land, that coordinates the spawning of coral reefs, that pulled the oceans and slowed the planet's spin and lengthened the day from 6 hours to 24. It's just hanging there, doing what it does. Scenario, leaving slowly. The night is quieter for having it. Rest now. It'll still be there in the morning. In 1944, the physiologist Ansel Keys conducted one of the most ethically complex studies in the history of nutrition science. He recruited 36 conscientious objectors, men who had refused military service on moral grounds and were willing to undergo hardship for science instead. He put them on a semi-starvation diet for 24 weeks, reducing their caloric intake to roughly half of normal. He wanted to understand what happened to the human body and mind during starvation, relevant to the rehabilitation of famine victims in post-war Europe. What he didn't fully anticipate was what happened to their minds. Within weeks, the men became obsessed with food, completely, totally consuming obsessed. They dreamed about food. They talked about nothing else. They collected recipes and cookbooks. Men who had no prior interest in cooking became fascinated by culinary techniques. They would spend hours planning meals they couldn't eat. Some began to hoard food, hiding it in their rooms, eating alone, becoming secretive and anxious about it. The obsession wasn't a personality trait or a psychological weakness. It was a direct neurological response to deprivation. The brain, sensing a critical resource, was unavailable, allocated an increasing proportion of its cognitive resources to obtaining that resource. Obsession, at its core, is the brain's response to perceived scarcity of something it needs. The neuroscience of obsession involves the same dopamine anticipation system that drives addiction. The key feature is that dopamine is released in anticipation of reward, in the wanting, not the getting. When the reward is consistently unavailable, the wanting doesn't decrease. It intensifies. The object of obsession, whether food, a person, a goal, a substance, becomes the primary target of the dopamine system's anticipatory firing. Thoughts about the object become intrusive because the brain keeps generating them as part of the motivational machinery. The person isn't choosing to think obsessively about the thing. The brain is generating those thoughts automatically as part of a drive state. This is why telling someone to just stop thinking about it is spectacularly unhelpful. The thoughts aren't voluntary. They're symptoms of a neurological state. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is the clinical extreme of this mechanism. The brain generates intrusive thoughts, often about harm, contamination, symmetry, or moral transgression, and then generates anxiety about those thoughts, and then generates compulsive behaviors designed to neutralize the anxiety, and then temporarily relieves the anxiety through the compulsion, which reinforces the cycle. The thoughts are not meaningful in the sense of reflecting the person's actual desires or intentions. People with OCD who have intrusive thoughts about harming loved ones are not people who want to harm their loved ones. They are people whose threat detection system has misfired into a loop that generates the most horrifying thoughts possible as a form of threat testing, checking whether something terrible might happen and then can't turn off the checking. The suffering is real, and the content of the thoughts is not. Romantic obsession occupies a specific neurological territory that has been studied using brain imaging. Helen Fisher at Rutgers imaged the brains of people in the early stages of intense romantic attachment. What she found was activation patterns similar to addiction: the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, the caudate nucleus, the dopamine reward circuits running hot in anticipation of the beloved. Early romantic love is neurologically closer to obsession than to the stable, affectionate attachment that long-term relationships settle into. The intrusive thoughts, the difficulty concentrating on anything else, the heightened sensitivity to cues associated with the person, the emotional volatility, these are features of a dopamine system in a high anticipation state, not character flaws or signs of psychological instability. They're also notably features that evolution would favor. An organism intensely focused on securing a specific mate is more likely to secure that mate than one who is casually interested. The obsessive quality of early romantic love may be a feature rather than a bug. The line between passionate dedication and destructive obsession is real, but not always obvious from the inside. Dedicated athletes, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, the people who achieve things at the extreme end of human capability almost universally describe something that sounds like obsession. The intrusive thoughts about the work, the difficulty being fully present to anything else, the prioritization of the pursuit above comfort and sometimes above relationships. From outside, this looks like admirable dedication. From inside, it often feels compulsive. Many highly successful people describe not being fully able to choose to stop the drive, having a quality of involuntariness that is genuinely uncomfortable even when the outcomes are positive. The difference between productive obsession and destructive obsession seems to be less about the intensity of the focus and more about whether the object of obsession is something achievable, whether the pursuit is causing net harm to the person and their relationships, and whether the person retains some capacity for perspective and recovery. The Zeigarnik effect is a related phenomenon. Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik noticed that waiters remembered uncompleted orders much better than completed ones. Once a task was finished, it faded from memory. Uncompleted tasks stayed active, generated intrusive thoughts, demanded attention, resisted being set aside. The brain treats unfinished business as an open loop that requires mental resources to maintain the obsessive quality of certain thoughts, the argument you keep replaying, the problem you can't let go of, the conversation you wish you'd handled differently is partly the Zeigarnik effect operating on unresolved experiences. A closure where it's available quiets the loop, where it's not available, deliberately and consciously deciding to set something aside, scheduling a time to return to it, writing it down, performing some small ritual of acknowledgement, can partially satisfy the brain's need to not lose track of it. The loops that have been running today are allowed to pause tonight. The unfinished business will still be unfinished in the morning. The open questions will still be open. But the brain doesn't have to maintain them through the night. You can set them down, not abandon them. Just put them somewhere safe until morning. they'll be there. The loops can wait, rest now. Your body has two modes, fed and fasted, and for most of human evolutionary history, the transition between them happened regularly, whether people wanted it to or not. Food was not always available. Periods of scarcity were built into the fabric of existence. The human metabolism was shaped by an environment where eating constantly was simply not an option. The modern food environment is the first in human history where continuous eating is possible, where you can go from waking to sleeping with insulin elevated all day, digestion running constantly, the fasted state never really entered, and the metabolism, shaped by millions of years of feast and famine cycling, doesn't entirely know what to do with that. What happens when you fast, when you deliberately allow the fasted state to occur, is a cascade of metabolic events that the body has been ready to run for a very long time. The first thing that happens is the most obvious: blood glucose drops as the glucose from your last meal is used up, insulin levels fall, and as insulin falls, fat cells receive the signal they've been waiting for. The hormonal lock on fat release opens, and fatty acids begin flowing out of storage into the bloodstream to be used as fuel. This transition from glucose burning to fat burning is called metabolic switching. In most people who eat regularly, it takes somewhere between 12 and 18 hours of fasting to fully occur, which means for many people who eat from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, the fasted state is barely entered even overnight. Once the switch is made, the liver begins converting fatty acids into ketone bodies, an alternative fuel source that the brain, heart, and muscles can all use effectively. Ketones are not a compromised fuel. In some respects, they're a premium one. The brain runs efficiently on ketones. Some research suggests more efficiently than on glucose in certain contexts. Autophagy is the process that has attracted the most research attention in fasting science, and for good reason. When cellular energy is scarce, the body initiates a cleanup protocol. Damaged proteins, dysfunctional organelles, cellular debris, material that would otherwise accumulate, get packaged and degraded. The components are recycled. The cell emerges cleaner and more functional. Yoshinori Ohsumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2016 for his work characterizing autophagy. The research showed it's not merely cellular housekeeping, but a fundamental process involved in protection against cancer, neurodegeneration, infection, and aging. Autophagy is suppressed by insulin eating, particularly eating carbohydrates and protein raises insulin, which suppresses autophagy. The process runs most actively in the fasted state, particularly during extended fasting beyond 24 hours. This is one of the mechanisms by which fasting appears to have health benefits beyond simple calorie reduction. The cells are getting cleaned. The cleanup only runs when you're not eating. Growth hormone is another variable that behaves counterintuitively during fasting. Growth hormone is involved in tissue repair, muscle maintenance, fat metabolism, and the cluster of effects associated with cellular regeneration. You might expect it to drop during fasting, the body conserving resources, down-regulating anabolic processes. The opposite happens. Growth hormone levels increase dramatically during fasting. Studies have shown 5-fold increases after 2 days of fasting. The mechanism appears to be partly preservative. Growth hormone protects muscle mass during the energy deficit, ensuring that the body burns fat rather than muscle. Your body, when deprived of food, actively works to preserve and potentially enhance the lean tissue you have. The mental effects of fasting are something most people who fast report, but that are harder to study than the metabolic effects. The clarity, the sense of heightened focus that many people describe after the initial transition through the fasted state, the absence of the post-meal cognitive fog that follows large carbohydrate-heavy meals. Some of this is probably ketones, the brain running on a fuel source. It handles well without the blood glucose fluctuations that cause the energy crashes associated with carbohydrate metabolism. Some of it may be norepinephrine, which rises during fasting as part of the metabolic adaptation, a neurotransmitter associated with alertness and focus. Some of it is probably the absence of digestion. Digestion requires substantial blood flow and metabolic resources. The digestive system is not a passive tube, it's metabolically active, demanding significant energy to run. When it goes quiet, those resources become available elsewhere. The historical and religious traditions around fasting are global and ancient. Ramadan, Yom Kippur, Lent, Buddhist fasting practices, Hindu fasting days, indigenous traditions of fasting before ceremony or vision quests. Every major religious and spiritual tradition has incorporated deliberate food abstinence in some form. The explanations vary: purification, discipline, prayer, connection to the divine. But the universality suggests something beyond cultural specificity. Humans across every culture discovered independently that periodically not eating produced a state that felt meaningful, that the altered physiology of the fasted state had qualities worth seeking. Whether those qualities are primarily spiritual, primarily physiological, or inseparably both is a question that depends on your framework. The state is real. People have been deliberately inducing it for as long as recorded history reaches.
Right now, your body is in the early stages of its nightly fast.
Insulin dropping, the metabolic switch beginning its slow turn, whatever cleanup processes your cells run, doing their quiet work, you didn't have to do anything to initiate it. You just stopped eating. The body took it from there, the way it has every night of your life, running its protocols in the dark, without asking for anything from you. This is what maintenance looks like from the outside. You just lie here. The system does the rest. Arrest now. In 1871, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann stood on a hill in northwestern Turkey and started digging. Everyone told him he was wasting his time. Troy was a myth. Homer's Iliad was poetry, not history. The war, the heroes, the city, all of it was ancient storytelling, not an account of real events in real places. Schliemann dug anyway. What he found underneath that hill were the ruins of not one but 9 successive cities built on top of each other over thousands of years. The city now designated Troy 7, dating to around 1180 BC, showing evidence of violent destruction and fire, is the layer most historians associate with the Homeric Troy. The city was real. The war may have been real. The thing everyone knew was a myth, was a memory. Dwarka is a city in northwestern India that sits partially submerged off the coast of Gujarat in the Gulf of Hambat. The ancient city above water is one of the holiest sites in Hinduism, one of the 4 sacred dams, the abode of Krishna, according to Hindu scripture. But in 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting sonar surveys of the Gulf and found something unexpected on the ocean floor. Scenario geometric structures, grids, ruins extending across a large area at depths of around 30 to 40 meters below current sea level. Carbon dating of organic material found at the site suggested the submerged structures were around 9,500 years old. 9,500 years that predates the oldest known cities by several thousand years. If confirmed, it would represent a settlement from before what we consider the dawn of civilization. The research has been controversial and not fully published. The interpretation of the sonar images and the dating has been questioned, but the structures are there. Something is on the ocean floor. What it is and what it means remain contested. Scenario Cahokia was a city in what is now Illinois, across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis. At its peak around 1100 AD. It was home to an estimated 10 to 20,000 people, larger than London at the time. It was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. Its central mound, Monk's Mound, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city covered an area of roughly 14 square kilometers and contained over 120 earthen mounds of various sizes and purposes, and then it was abandoned. By around 1350 AD, the city was empty. No European ever saw it occupied, no written record. Explains what happened. The people who built it, the Mississippian culture, dispersed into smaller communities, and the city they had built slowly returned to forest. We don't know why they left. Drought has been proposed, social instability, environmental degradation from feeding a large urban population, disease. The abandonment is simply a fact without a surviving explanation. A city larger than medieval London, empty, forgotten, rediscovered only through archaeology. Petra is not lost in the sense of being unknown. It's one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, but the civilization that built it, the Nabatean kingdom, is less well known than the city deserves. The Nabateans were Arab traders who built a commercial empire controlling the spice and incense routes between Arabia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. At their peak, they controlled trade routes across thousands of kilometers. Their capital was carved directly into the rose-red sandstone cliffs of what is now southern Jordan. Not built against the cliffs, carved into them, temples, tombs, theaters, administrative buildings, all cut from living rock. The treasury, the most photographed structure, is a facade carved into a cliff face roughly 40 meters high with extraordinary precision and detail. The Nabateans were also hydraulic engineers of genius. in a desert environment receiving less than 100 millimeters of rainfall annually. They built a system of cisterns, pipes, and channels that collected and stored enough water to support a city of perhaps 30,000 people. The Roman Empire absorbed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD. The trade route shifted, the city declined. By the Byzantine period, it was largely abandoned. It was rediscovered by a Swiss explorer in 1812. The local Bedouin knew it was there, but to the Western world it had been lost for over 1,000 years. Nan Madol sits off the eastern coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia. It is a series of artificial islands built in a lagoon, nearly 100 small islands connected by canals, built from prismatic basalt logs stacked like Lincoln logs, covering about 18 square kilometers. The basalt came from the other side of the island, how it was transported, stones weighing up to 50 tons, across the island and into the lagoon to construct artificial islands is not known. The local oral tradition says the stones flew through the air, moved by magic. The city was the ceremonial and political center of the Saudadlur dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei for perhaps 500 years. It was abandoned around 1628 AD. The jungle has partially reclaimed it. It sits in the lagoon, slowly subsiding, the canals silting up, the basalt logs gradually being covered. It is one of the most remarkable things human beings have built, and almost nobody has heard of it. The planet is full of places where people built extraordinary things and then left. Some left because of catastrophe, some left because the conditions that made the place viable changed, some left for reasons that time has completely erased. The cities are still there, underwater, under jungle, under later cities, under sand, waiting to be found. Or not, the ground under every city you've ever been in contains layers of things built and abandoned and built over history going down as well as back. All the way to the first people who stood on that particular ground and decided to stay, rest now. You're part of a very long story. Scenario one that started long before you and will continue long after tonight is just your chapter. Rest in it. A scenario in 1945, the United States Army conducted tests on the effects of infrasound on human beings. Infrasound is sound below the threshold of human hearing, below 20 hertz frequencies that you don't consciously perceive as sound, but that your body still responds to. The tests found that exposure to infrasound at sufficient intensity produced disorientation, nausea, bowel disturbance, and in some subjects, extreme psychological disturbance, panic, dread, a feeling of presence, a sense that something was deeply wrong without any identifiable cause. The military was interested in infrasound as a potential weapon. The research was eventually declassified. What it revealed is that sound at frequencies below human perception can produce profound physiological and psychological effects that the person experiencing them doesn't attribute to sound because they can't hear anything. The feeling of unease in certain spaces, the inexplicable dread in rooms that seem normal, the sense of presence in empty places. Some researchers have proposed that infrasound generated by wind interacting with building structures or by industrial equipment or by geological processes accounts for at least some reports of haunted locations. Not all of it, but some of it, sound doing things to the body that the conscious mind never attributes to sound. The constructive side of sound on the human body is better documented and more widely known. Ultrasound, sound above the upper threshold of human hearing, above 20,000 hertz, has been used medically for decades. Diagnostic ultrasound produces images of internal organs and developing fetuses through reflected sound waves. Therapeutic ultrasound uses sound energy to accelerate tissue healing, reduce inflammation, and break up kidney stones. Lithotripsy, the use of focused acoustic shock waves to shatter kidney stones, is a routine medical procedure. Sound waves focused to a point inside the body carry enough energy to break calcified material without cutting. The patient feels vibration and some discomfort. The stone fragments and passes naturally. A sound as a scalpel, a non-invasive surgical instrument made of nothing but pressure waves in a medium. The human voice's effect on the nervous system is something we experience constantly without thinking about it. Scenario, a calm voice slows breathing and heart rate. A raised, anxious voice accelerates them. A voice with the specific prosodic features of a lullaby, slow tempo, descending melodic lines, soft dynamics, produces measurable relaxation responses in infants and adults. The effect is partly learned association and partly something more fundamental. The auditory system is wired to extract social and threat information from voice quality in ways that bypass conscious processing. ASMR, autonomous sensory meridian response, the tingling relaxation response that some people experience in response to certain soft sounds, is a real phenomenon that researchers have only recently begun to study. The sounds that trigger it tend to involve close proximity, soft speech, gentle, repetitive sounds. The response appears to involve a relaxation of the autonomic nervous system and a reduction in heart rate. Whether it's a misfire of an evolved response to close nurturing contact or a distinct sensory phenomenon in its own right is debated. The physiological response is real and measurable. Tinnitus is the dark side of sound's relationship to the nervous system. Roughly 15% of people experience tinnitus, a persistent phantom sound, usually a ringing or buzzing with no external source. It's generated by the auditory system itself, typically as a result of hearing damage, though in some cases the cause is unclear. What makes tinnitus particularly tormenting is the attention system's relationship to it, because the sound is constant and internal. The brain can't habituate to it the way it habituates to external sounds. The refrigerator hum, you stop noticing. The traffic, you tune out. The tinnitus doesn't go away when you stop paying attention to it. In quiet environments, it becomes more prominent. At night, when other sounds are absent, it can dominate. The suffering from tinnitus is not proportional to its volume. People with relatively quiet tinnitus can be severely distressed. People with louder tinnitus can habituate and find it barely noticeable. The distress is determined by the relationship to the sound, the monitoring, the catastrophizing, the fear of it, more than the sound itself. Tinnitus therapies that work best focus on changing that relationship rather than eliminating the sound. Binaural beats are an auditory illusion created by playing slightly different frequencies in each ear. If you play a 400 hertz tone in the left ear and 410 hertz in the right, the brain perceives a beat at the difference. 10 hertz, even though no 10 hertz tone exists in the audio, the brain is generating the beat by comparing the two inputs. Different beat frequencies are associated with different brain states. Delta waves with deep sleep, theta with drowsiness and meditation, alpha with relaxed wakefulness, beta with active thinking. The theory is that binaural beats can entrain brain waves to a desired frequency. The research on binaural beats is mixed. Some studies show effects on anxiety, focus, and sleep. Others find minimal effects. The mechanism is real. The brain does generate the perceived beat. Whether this entrains brain activity in meaningful ways is less certain. But the auditory system's ability to generate a perception that doesn't exist in the physical world from two inputs that separately don't contain it. It is fascinating, regardless of the therapeutic applications. The brain building something from nothing, from the comparison of two signals, the way it builds so much else. The ambient sound around you right now, however quiet it is being processed. The auditory system never fully turns off. It remains partially active during sleep, monitoring for significant sounds. The sounds that wake you and the sounds that don't are not random. The brain is applying learned threat detection criteria even while you're unconscious. Your name spoken softly will wake you more reliably than a louder, unfamiliar sound. The system knows what matters. It's listening even now. But right now, there's nothing to hear. Just the quiet, which is its own kind of sound. The sound of safe arrest now. A scenario in 1979, two men met for the first time at the age of 39. They had been separated at birth and adopted by different families in Ohio. Both had been named James by their adoptive parents. Both had married women named Linda, divorced and remarried women named Betty. Both had sons named James Allen. Both had dogs named Toy. Both worked in law enforcement. Both drove the same model of Chevrolet. But both had the same chronic headaches in the same location that had started at the same age. The Jim twins, as they became known, became the most famous case in the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, a research project that tracked identical twins who had been separated early in life and raised in different environments. The study ran for 2 decades and produced findings that fundamentally changed how scientists think about the relationship between genes and environment. The similarities between separated identical twins are not just striking, they are philosophically disturbing. identical twins, monozygotic twins, develop from a single fertilized egg that splits in the first few days after conception. The result is two individuals with essentially identical DNA, not similar, identical, the same genome running in two separate bodies. Fraternal twins, dizygotic, develop from two separate eggs fertilized by two separate sperm. They share on average 50% of their DNA, the same as any siblings. They happen to develop at the same time, but are genetically no more similar than brothers and sisters born years apart. The distinction matters enormously for research. By comparing identical twins to fraternal twins and identical twins raised together to identical twins raised apart, researchers can begin to disentangle the contributions of genes and environment to virtually any human characteristic. What they've found has been consistently surprising to people who believe environment is the dominant shaper of who we are. Heritability is the technical measure of how much of the variation in a trait across a population is explained by genetic variation. A heritability of 1 means genes explain everything, a heritability of 0 means genes explain nothing, and environment explains everything. Almost nothing has a heritability of 0 intelligence, has a heritability of somewhere between 50 and 80% in adults, higher than most people expect. Personality traits, extroversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism have heritabilities in the 40 to 60% range. Political attitudes, religious participation, even TV watching habits show significant heritability. This doesn't mean environment doesn't matter. It means that among people who grow up in roughly similar environments, the variation between them is substantially explained by genetic differences. The genes are doing more work than intuition suggests. The Minnesota twin study found that identical twins raised apart were nearly as similar to each other as identical twins raised together on measures of personality, intelligence, interests, and social attitudes. This is the finding that disturbs people most. If you take two genetically identical people and raise them in completely different families, different cities, different socioeconomic circumstances, different schools, different peer groups, they still end up remarkably similar. The environment is doing less than we thought. The genes are doing more. The implication is uncomfortable because it challenges the deeply held belief that we are primarily the product of our experiences, that who we are is something that happens to us that is shaped by what we go through, that could have been substantially different if we'd grown up differently. For identical twins raised apart, it often couldn't have been not as different as we'd expect. The epigenetic story complicates this in interesting ways. Epigenetics refers to changes in gene expression, which genes are turned on or turned off, that don't involve changes to the DNA sequence itself. Environmental factors can alter epigenetic markers, diet, stress, exposure to toxins, exercise. These experiences can change which genes are expressed without changing the underlying code. Identical twins start with identical epigenetic profiles. As they age and accumulate different experiences, their epigenetic profiles diverge. The longer they live apart, the more different their gene expression becomes, even as their DNA remains identical. This means that as identical twins age, they become, in some biological ways, less identical. The genes are the same, but the expression of those genes has been shaped by different lives. The DNA is the score, the epigenome is the performance, same score, different conductors, different halls. The music comes out differently. Mirror image twins are a subset of identical twins that occur when the egg splits later than usual, typically between 9 and 12 days after fertilization, rather than the more common 1 to 4 days. The result is twins who are mirror images of each other. One is right-handed, one left-handed. One has a birthmark on the right cheek, the other on the left. Internal organs can even be mirrored. One twin may have the heart on the right side of the chest. The later the split, the more complete the mirroring, and the later the split, the higher the risk of conjoined twins, twins in whom the split was incomplete. Conjoined twins who survive and reach adulthood offer the most extreme possible case study in the relationship between shared biology and individual identity. Abby and Brittany Hensel, perhaps the most documented case, share a single body. 2 heads, 2 spines, 2 hearts, partially shared internal organs, and are unambiguously 2 distinct people. Different personalities, different preferences, different career paths is the same body containing 2 genuinely separate individuals. If that's possible, if 2 people can share a body and remain distinct, then identity is not located in the body in any simple sense. The self is more than the physical. Twin telepathy, the popular idea that twins share a psychic connection, has not been supported by controlled research. Twins are not statistically better than chance at guessing what their twin is thinking or experiencing when separated. What twins do share is an unusually well-calibrated model of another person, built through years of close observation of someone with nearly identical responses to the world. The apparent telepathy is usually extremely accurate prediction based on deep knowledge of a very similar person, which is impressive in its own right without requiring anything paranormal. Somewhere tonight, there may be someone asleep who shares your genome, or there may not be. Most people are unique in that specific sense. But either way, the genome itself is not entirely yours. Half came from one person, half from another, before that, halves from 4 people, before that, 8. The further back you go, the more people contributed to the specific configuration of DNA that is running your body tonight. You are a collaboration, a very long-running one. Rest now. The collaboration continues while you sleep. In 1975, a physician named Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life. He had collected accounts from people who had been clinically dead, heart stopped, no measurable brain activity, and then resuscitated. What struck him was not that people reported experiences during that period, it was that the experiences were consistent. Across different people, different ages, different backgrounds, different belief systems, the accounts shared specific features that Moody hadn't expected and couldn't explain. The tunnel, the light, the life review, the sense of peace, the feeling of leaving the body and observing it from above, the encounter with deceased relatives, the reluctance to return. Moody called them near-death experiences. The term stuck, the phenomenon, whatever it is, has been studied seriously ever since. The consistency across cultures and belief systems is the most interesting feature of near-death experience research and the hardest to explain away. A devout Christian and a committed atheist, a Buddhist monk and someone with no religious beliefs whatsoever report experiences with the same core structure. The specific content varies. The figures encountered tend to match the person's cultural framework. The religious imagery is culturally specific, but the underlying architecture is remarkably stable. This consistency cuts both ways in the debate about what these experiences mean. For those who believe they represent genuine glimpses of an afterlife, the cross-cultural consistency suggests something universal is being perceived, a reality that exists independently of the beliefs of the person experiencing it. For those who believe they are products of the dying brain, the consistency suggests a common neurological mechanism, the same brain structures producing the same experiences when under the same extreme stress regardless of the cultural overlay. Both interpretations are consistent with the data, neither is proven by it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, is an 8th century Buddhist text that functions as a guide to the experience of dying and the period between death and rebirth. It describes a sequence of experiences in remarkable detail: the moment of death and the dissolution of consciousness, the clear light that appears immediately after death, which the text says represents the fundamental nature of mind and which, if recognized, leads to liberation, the peaceful and wrathful deities that appear in subsequent stages, the judgment of past actions, the gradual narrowing of options as the consciousness moves toward rebirth. The text was designed to be read aloud to the dying and the recently dead, the Tibetan tradition holding that consciousness persists for some time after clinical death and can be guided by instruction. Whether or not the cosmology is literally true, the text represents one of the most detailed and sophisticated attempts any culture has made to map the territory of dying, and some of its features, the clear light, the life review, the encounter with compassionate and terrifying figures, appear in near-death experience accounts from people who have never heard of it. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife were elaborate, specific, and central to the entire culture in a way that shaped everything from architecture to daily life. The soul was not a single thing, but a complex of different components. The Ka was a life force that remained near the body after death, which is why preserving the body through mummification mattered. The Ba was something closer to personality or individual identity, which could move between the world of the living and the dead. The Ak was the transformed spirit that resulted from the successful union of Ka and Ba after death. The judgment of the dead involved the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, truth and justice. A heart heavy with wrongdoing would be devoured by Ammit, a creature combining crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. A heart light enough would proceed to the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt where the deceased lived in continued existence. The specificity is striking. Not just the idea of an afterlife, but a detailed geography, a specific procedure, specific consequences, a complete bureaucracy of the dead. The ancient Greek underworld was not primarily a place of reward and punishment in the way later traditions developed. It was simply where the dead went. The shades, the insubstantial remnants of people, existed in Hades in a diminished form without the full vitality of life. Odysseus in the Odyssey visits the underworld and finds the shade of Achilles, who tells him that it is better to be a living slave than the king of the dead. Even the greatest hero preferred any form of life to the shadowland of death. There were special destinations for the exceptional: Elysium for heroes favored by the gods, Tartarus for those who had offended the gods specifically, but the default afterlife was gray continuation rather than heaven or hell existence without the warmth of life. Indigenous traditions around afterlife tend to emphasize continuity with the living community rather than departure to a separate realm. Ancestor veneration practiced across sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, Mesoamerica, and many other cultures is based on the understanding that the dead remain members of the community with ongoing interest, relationships, and agency. They can be communicated with, offended, appeased, consulted. The boundary between living and dead is permeable rather than absolute. The Day of the Dead in Mexican tradition, blending indigenous Aztec beliefs with Catholic influences, is one of the most visible expressions of this. The dead return annually. They are welcomed. They eat and drink symbolically with the living. The relationship continues. The dead as ancestors rather than departed strangers. The community extending across the boundary of death rather than ending at it. Scenario near-death experience research has produced one genuinely difficult finding for the purely neurological explanation. Some people report accurate observations of events that occurred while they were clinically dead, observations of their own resuscitation from a perspective outside their body, details of conversations in adjacent rooms, things seen from a vantage point physically impossible from the position of the body. These veridical, out-of-body observations are not universal. They are not consistently documented, but they exist in the literature in forms that are difficult to explain as hallucination or confabulation. The most rigorous attempt to study them, the AWARE study led by Sam Parnia, placed visual targets in hospital resuscitation rooms, visible only from above, intending to check whether out-of-body observers reported seeing them. The study was inconclusive, not enough cases with targets in the right locations. The experiment was the right one. The data wasn't sufficient. The question remains open. Every culture that is left records has had something to say about what comes after death. Not all of them agree. The specific geographies and procedures and conditions vary enormously. But the universality of the question, the universality of the answer that something continues, is itself a fact about human beings worth sitting with. Whether it reflects genuine perception of something real or the mind's inability to model its own non-existence or something else entirely, we don't know. What we know is that every human being who has ever lived has faced the same uncertainty you face. And most of them slept anyway. Rest now. The question will still be there in the morning. It has waited this long. In 1960, a relatively unknown senator from Massachusetts debated the sitting vice president of the United States on live television. Richard Nixon was the more experienced politician by almost any measure. He had served as Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. He was substantively prepared by most accounts of people who listened to the debate on radio. Nixon won, or the result was a draw. The people who watched on TV thought Kennedy won decisively. Nixon was pale, had refused makeup, was sweating under the lights, and looked uncomfortable. Kennedy was tanned, relaxed, and looked directly into the camera as if he was talking to each viewer personally. The same words, heard differently depending on the medium, produced different conclusions about who should be president. Kennedy had something Nixon didn't, something that operated below the level of argument and policy, something transmitted through the body and the face and the voice before a single word was processed for content, charisma, and it changed the outcome of a presidential election. Charisma is one of those qualities that everyone can identify and almost no one can define precisely. We know it when we see it. We feel it in the presence of certain people, the pull of their attention, the sense that they are fully present with you, the ease with which they hold a room. We feel its absence just as clearly. For most of history, it was treated as an innate quality, something you either had or didn't. Mysterious in origin, unteachable. The word itself comes from the Greek for divine gift. Charisma was what the gods gave certain people The scientific study of charisma has largely dismantled this mystique, not by explaining it away, but by revealing that it is a learnable cluster of specific behaviors and physiological states that reliably produce predictable effects on other people. The divine gift turns out to be a skill set. The most fundamental element of charisma is presence. Not presence in the vague motivational sense, presence in the specific sense of where your attention actually is in a given moment. Charismatic people are fully attending to whoever they are with. They are not thinking about the next thing they want to say, not monitoring how they're coming across, not distracted by ambient concerns. They are genuinely, completely interested in the person in front of them. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily rare. The effect on the person being attended to is powerful and immediate. Being fully seen, having someone's complete and genuine attention, produces a neurological response, oxytocin, a sense of warmth and connection, a positive association with the person providing the attention. We are social animals who have evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to the quality of attention others direct toward us. Full, genuine attention feels like a gift because evolutionarily it was one. It signaled social investment and safe relationship. Charismatic people make you feel in their presence that you're the most interesting person in the room, not because they say so, because their attention demonstrates it. Body language accounts for a disproportionate amount of the charisma effect. The research on nonverbal communication consistently finds that physical signals, posture, gesture, facial expression, movement carry more weight in social perception than verbal content. The body is communicating constantly, and the audience is reading it constantly, mostly below conscious awareness. Charismatic body language shares specific features across individuals and cultures, expansive rather than contracted posture, taking up space rather than making yourself small, slow, deliberate movement rather than nervous, jerky movement, open rather than closed positioning, arms uncrossed, body oriented toward rather than away from the other person. Stillness when still, full commitment when moving. These signals communicate status and safety simultaneously. High status, I'm not threatened, I have resources, I'm not desperate. Safe, I'm open to you, I'm not concealing or defending, you can trust me. The combination of high status and safety is rare. Status without safety is intimidating. Safety without status is pitied. The combination is magnetic. Vocal qualities contribute significantly to charisma in ways that have been quantified. Studies of charismatic speakers consistently find specific vocal patterns, slower overall pace with strategic variation, speeding up for excitement and slowing dramatically for emphasis, wider pitch range, more vocal expressiveness, more music in the voice, lower average pitch associated with authority and calm. More resonance voices that seem to come from the chest rather than the throat or head. These are not fixed traits. They are states. A person who is anxious and self-monitoring tends toward higher pitch, faster pace, less variation, less resonance. A person who is genuinely confident and focused tends toward the opposite. The vocal qualities that read as charismatic are the natural output of a specific physiological and psychological state: calm, confident, genuinely engaged. This is why trying to perform charisma by mimicking the vocal patterns without the underlying state tends to come across as hollow. The voice is reporting a state. If the state isn't there, the voice can't fully fake it. Warmth is the component of charisma most often underestimated in the analytical literature on the subject. Status and presence without warmth produce a different effect, commanding, perhaps impressive, but not charismatic in the full sense. Warmth, the genuine sense that the charismatic person wishes you well, cares about your experience, is on your side, is what converts status into something people want to be near rather than something they merely respect. The warmth has to be real, or real enough, performed warmth. The customer service smile, the politician's practice concern, reads as false to most people at a level below conscious awareness. Micro-expressions, subtle vocal qualities, tiny inconsistencies between what the face says and what the eyes say. The social brain is picking all of this up and generating an impression of authenticity or inauthenticity that arrives as a feeling rather than a conclusion. People know, not always consciously, but they know Howard Friedman at the University of California developed something called the effective communication test, a measure of how effectively a person transmits their emotional states to others. People who score high are what he calls charismatic senders. Their emotions are contagious. When they are enthusiastic, you feel enthusiasm. When they are calm, you feel calm. When they are serious, the room becomes serious. Friedman found that charismatic senders were rated as healthier, happier, and more attractive than low scorers, even in photographs with neutral expressions. The capacity to transmit emotional states was correlated with perceptions that went far beyond what the transmission should logically affect. Emotional contagion is the mechanism. Humans are social animals whose nervous systems are partially synchronized with the people around them. Mirror neurons fire in response to observed actions and expressions. The emotional state of a high charisma person propagates into the nervous systems of people nearby. You don't just observe their confidence, you feel it a little in your own body. The charismatic person is not just communicating to you, they are partially regulating your nervous system through theirs. The implications of charisma research are uncomfortable in a specific way. We like to believe that we evaluate people and ideas on their merits, that the quality of the argument is what persuades us that the content of the character is what we respond to, that our social judgments are rational processes. Charisma research consistently shows that this is partially true and substantially false. Physical presence, vocal qualities, emotional expressiveness, and the quality of attention someone directs at us shape our perceptions of their intelligence, honesty, competence, and moral character in ways that have nothing to do with actual intelligence, honesty, competence, or moral character. The most charismatic person in the room is perceived as the most capable, not always, not perfectly, but reliably, significantly across contexts. Knowing this is useful, it allows you to be a more careful evaluator of your own impressions. The person who makes you feel good to be around is not necessarily the person who is good for you to be around. The feeling and the reality can diverge. The most charismatic person you've ever met probably made you feel, at least for a moment, like the most interesting person in the room. Whether that feeling reflected their genuine interest or a cultivated skill or both doesn't change what it felt like. A connection feels like connection regardless of its source, and the need for it is real regardless of how it's satisfied. Tonight, let that need rest. It doesn't have to be met right now.
Just rest.
The connections that matter will still be there in the morning.